speaker is Matt Stephenson from Pantera Capital. Good friend of mine. Thank you so much for coming. And he'll do an amazing presentation on how autonomous agents transact. So make him comfortable, but please give a big round of applause for Matt.
This one? Cool. All right, thanks, everybody. Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. Honored to be here with you. Yeah, like Erica said, I'm the head of research at Pantera. I'm an economist, kind of behavioral game theorist by training. And looking forward to talking to you about kind of the transaction level for autonomous agents. So last year, me and some co-authors at Flashbots and Ethereum Foundation, one of whom will be presenting a little later, wrote this paper called Cooperative AI via Decentralized Commitment Devices, kind of at the interaction level, basically making the pitch that there's some good reasons to expect that blockchains would be useful for multi-agent systems, right, for coordination, specifically focusing on commitment. So I'm not going to get into that so much today, partly because I think Davide is going to present a little bit on that and also do a much better job. I already looked at his slides, so definitely be there for that. And I'm glad we're not going to overlap so much. And so there's also good frameworks on how you might think about this sort of like crypto AI interaction, right? Vitalik's got an excellent one that I would encourage people to check out. I just saw this yesterday on Twitter from Tarun Chitra. You know, one way to sort of think about it along this sort of like high dimensionality, low dimensionality space, and then this kind of like, you might call it sort of non-cooperative to semi-cooperative game theory on the x-axis and plotting it there. So this I would all sort of say is the interaction level, right? Like how will these agents, let's say interact? And so I want to focus on, I'm just going to assume away a couple of things that could be complicated and debatable, right? And I'm just going to assume the environment is some like always on, easily programmable settlement substrate, wink, wink, a blockchain, right? Something like that. And then who are the agents? This is where I'm going to be really kind of like hand wavy, I think in a way that's helpful, I hope, which is just the agents are things that are less cognitively constrained along certain dimensions than humans, right? So I'm not going to focus on any particular model, but I'm going to assume that you're unlocking certain types of cognitive constraints. And what does that look like? And then rather than focus on the nature of the strategic interactions, I'm going to focus on the transaction level, get really kind of micro, okay? And unfortunately, to get really micro, you'd think I'm going to have to introduce this like what is money junk that you all saw in like 2017 or whatever. It's not like this is bad, by the way. I think literally Aristotle came up with these three things, and nobody's argued with him since. So like it's probably true. It's just kind of like boring. But more recently, there's been attention paid to this other feature of money that we sort of know about, but haven't really modeled out super well until the last like 7 years, which is this no questions asked property of money. Or that the money is something that's information insensitive. That when you show up and present your money, people don't really have to like squint at it too closely or imagine what it's going to be worth in 5 months or anything like that, right? And so whatever this thing is that generates the transactability that doesn't invite new questions, right? The reason we don't transact with like, let's say watches, where you're like, well, I don't know, does the watch still tick? Like, how does it keep time? Like, what's the value going to be? All these things that would be cognitively costly. Money saves you those cognitive costs. So here's a quote from Gorton and Zhang. Gary Gorton is a Yale economist who's done a lot to further this theory, but it's originally from the great Nobel Prize winner Bengt Holmström. The property that's most obvious is that money must satisfy the no questions asked principle. That is, there's no due diligence involved. So there's some good evidence for this. If you look at T-bill yields, basically predicted T-bill yields compared to realized, you find that the curve gets really not smooth and really not predictive when you get to about 10 weeks of maturity. That's a little bit of a weird graph to read, but basically what you're seeing is that there on the left-hand side, people are paying extra money to have something that kind of feels like cash, right? It's a T-bill close to redemption. Thus, you don't really have to think about it. It's going to trade pretty close to par. And the fact that they're willing to pay extra money is what's called the cash premium, right? And that's some good empirical evidence for this no questions asked, this no questions asked aspect of money. It sounds like we're very far from AI. We're going to get back to it a little bit, okay? But hopefully the through line is present, okay? So you're with me so far. We have a theoretical reason to think money has this, one of the things we like about money is this no questions asked. And we have some empirical backing for this, right? That like what you might predict is that, you know, people might pay for a cash premium for things that look kind of cash-like. You see it in T-bills. And so what I want to kind of summarize this as is that this is a theory of bounded rationality. This is an aspect of our world that is sort of deeply human, and we might expect to change in interesting ways. And it might surprise us. So here's a tweet from a smart person saying like, hey, when AI agents use blockchains, they're going to manage USDC and safe multisigs and whatever, right? And so maybe so, right? Like I'm very happy with the AI agents will transact on a blockchain story. What I want to argue against is they won't use USDC. USDC is a human thing. It's a thing coming from the fact that we need something to sort of like say one for a really long time, right? That makes our transactions easier. But if we were less cognitively constrained, maybe not. And so this is a little cheeky, but if rationality got less bounded, you could imagine, I'm calling this the AI region, but right, a less cognitively constrained actor could transact using longer-term T-bills without having to pay this cash premium, right? So the transaction could be the same. They were able to model it out, right? And you wouldn't have to, you'd gain more money that way, right? So it's effectively like holding a higher yield asset, or maybe in some cases holding a productive asset. So let's say you go to Starbucks for a latte, right? Why doesn't the world look like this? And the perfectly rational actor, economic style barista says, okay, well, sure. Your personal mutual fund, your investment or whatever, it's going to be 0.001% of a share of that, right? And you're like, oh, of course, that's the accurate price of a latte. We know we can't do that, but if we could do that, then you would remain invested in productive assets the whole time, and you would no longer be paying cash premiums. So there's something desirable about the state of the world. It kind of makes you more money if you can do it. And so the question is, maybe can it be done? And I'm really not going to answer that question beyond sort of like gesturing to the idea that it seems obviously desirable, and it seems like something that if you relax computational constraints should be achievable at some level. And so that's kind of like where I'm leaving the direction of it and say, okay, well, it points us in this direction of a pretty old idea. This idea of mutual fund banking goes back to, I think, at least the 80s or 90s. And when you look at why people didn't like this idea, the idea that instead of using a bank and using dollars, you just transact kind of like I mentioned in the Starbucks example, based off shares of, I don't know, an index or mutual fund or your personal investment strategy. One is obvious, a lot of computational overhead or cognitive overhead to figure out how much these investments are worth. Another is regulatory, which this is bad slide design, by the way, to just put up a bunch of text. You're probably all just like reading the text and not listening to me, but I tried to pick boring enough text that maybe you wouldn't. But at any rate, yeah, so the idea is like, why doesn't this work? Well, one, the obvious one, and then which is the cognitive constraints. And then two, there's regulatory issues, right? Ultimately, you have to settle this stuff somewhere, and that somewhere is going to be a bank. I think obviously for the crypto people in the room, that part of the story has changed. And then if we think AI is going to change some of the cognitive constraints, then we might see the emergence of something that feels a little less like a stable coin and a little more like a mutual coin. Now, how would you create a mutual coin? Well, if you have been in crypto for a while, if you have seen this "what is money" thing done to death and heard it for every speech, going back to 2017, you know that there's like this kind of real-world assets sort of trend, a thing that we've been trying to get done for a long time. And there's one way to do it, right, which is you can sort of you can play nice with regulators and figure that out and do the hard work. And there's a company called Ondo that's kind of done that, where you might just get custody authenticated in a more regulated way. Or you can try and design in-protocol incentives to allow for gamified, kind of like governance-based custody. And there's an organization called M0 that's done that. And those are the two sort of poles that I feel like might be interesting as a way to custody things that aren't just necessarily stable coins, but feel like productive assets. And at the transaction level, you might think that's what it could look like. So we kind of got back to AI. But ultimately, that feels like an interesting sort of like transaction level change that you could foresee coming. And with that, thank you very much.